Welcome back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you not only of the most important truth in the entire universe, but the best truth in the entire universe. God loves you. And that, when you wrap your arms around it, is a game changer. But we have been, let's continue on with our journey here. We have been looking at this question of where did we come from? And we started off at the beginning and point of the universe of nothing, and we've been working our way up to where we are today. And the question we've been looking at recently here, and we've been starting to build up to where we're going to pick up speed and get going here in the weeks to come, is this movement from lifelessness to life. And then, and that's kind of where we've been for the last few weeks. And then we're going to take this massive jump forward, starting with this week's episode, after we lay a little groundwork this week. And we're going to jump through the problems of moving from that first cell to where we are today. And just to catch us up to where we are, along the journey, we've had to grant naturalism an enormous number of highly improbable, if not entirely impossible things. The jump from nothing to everything at the beginning of the universe, that's a huge admission to allow this process to keep going forward. The jump from lifelessness to life, I have woefully understated how big of an issue that really is. But to go from lifelessness to life. And so at each step along the way, we've had to continue to make allowances to keep naturalism going, because naturalism as a theory is built on three things: matter, time, and luck. I mean, call it chance if you want, but luck is really the better answer. And so as we've done this, we've kind of at each step along the way allowed for these things and said, well, the best explanation is that, most likely, of an intelligent designer. But to keep the discussion moving forward, what we've done is said, well, we'll grant that it happened. So we're going to grant that the jump from lifelessness to life happened, despite the problems that we talked about here a week or so ago when we were looking at this question of the cells that build us. So as we do that and as we walk forward, we're going to again reach a point here where we follow through on this question. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the best explanation as we move forward? Once you've got this first cell, the question that we need to address is, does Darwin's explanation of the direction that life is moving actually make any sense? And what are the problems that we're gonna face as we move forward? We're going to revisit a couple of things to kind of jumpstart us into the discussions over the next few weeks. But I want to bring these together into one point as we look at that this week. I think generally speaking, when we look around us, we can all agree that simple is better. And what we want in most of these things is simplicity as we're going forward. The more complex something becomes, the more likely it is to break down in a lot of ways. Occam's razor, I think, is a wonderful example of that idea of not needing to overcomplicate things with overly dramatic explanations when the more simple explanation is generally the preferred one. So when we make this jump from lifelessness to life, we have that first initial cell. And even if we grant that it happened, which is remarkably unlikely, if not impossible, again, but the odds of it happening twice seem to be ridiculously impossible. So we'll all agree, let's say, just to keep the discussion going, it happened once. So if we start with that initial cell on one hand and we look at us on the other hand, what is it that we've gained by this journey that we've taken? Because the whole idea of natural selection would tell you that life has been improving, it's been getting better. The problem is when I look around and I think about that very first cell, other than our ability to cognitively consider the question, which is important, I'll grant you, although I don't know that it's necessary for the existence of life, I want you to think about that very first cell for a moment. That very first cell was really the height of evolutionary life in many ways. Number one, it was completely self-sufficient. So it didn't need anything. It didn't need shelter. It didn't need clothing. It didn't need companionship. It was good to go. And the reason that we know that is because, well, none of those things would have existed at that point. I mean, it was in the harshest of environments, an environment that could not have been tremendously welcoming to life. I mean, we don't entirely know, but what we know about Earth's early atmosphere is that it was not friendly to life. But when we think about that first cell, it was incredibly self-sufficient. We know because life survived. And life not only survived, it thrived somehow. So it was also self-sustaining, which is remarkable because, well, and this is where you could argue, well, the type of life that originated would have been, it would have been something that would have been compatible with the environment around it. So it would have been something that could have survived, and I understand and I agree, but it obviously had not only the ability to be created, to create itself, essentially, but to sustain itself. And we don't know what that nourishment or lack thereof would have been, but it's remarkable that it was able to not only sustain itself, but do so for an enormously long period of time. Because again, the odds of it happening once are nearly impossible, well, to be honest, they're impossible. But if it happened once, what are the odds that it would happen again? And the odds of that would have to be essentially zero. So not only was it capable of sustaining itself, it was self-sufficient, and it could also reproduce all on its own. Again, how do we know this? Well, because more than one cell. Here we are all the way, according to the story of Darwinian evolution, here we are all the way, all of us, all the way down the line from this very first cell that originated. How does that happen? And the interesting thing is when you look at us compared to that very first cell, I mean, obviously we can, like I said, we can comprehend and consider this and have this debate and discussion, which is fascinating and interesting. I don't know that it's necessary for the existence of life, but when you look at us, we require food, we require shelter, we obviously require a partner to reproduce and things like that, and for companionship and all of these things. When you look at us as a species, we get kind of proud of ourselves and we get a little bit arrogant and think, well, we're the height of evolutionary experience out there. But are we? Are we really? And I think I would argue that we've gone in the opposite direction. We are a very complex and difficult life form. We spend most of our time trying to survive and building houses and working jobs to go buy food and transportation and all of these things to live and thrive and survive. And yet this first life form didn't have to do any of that. So it feels a bit like we've been heading in the wrong direction. Life seems to have become much more fragile and much more complicated down the road. So I'm not sure I understand the theory of how we've been progressing and improving, because it feels like at every step along the way, we've been becoming more complex and difficult as any species on the planet. So that's difficult to understand, number one. But when we look at this, the other thing that we're going to have to recognize along this journey is we went from that very first simple cell, because again, the odds of a very simple cell being produced were basically zero. But the odds of a complex cell like the ones inside of us, it's just mathematically impossible, basically. And again, I'm going to go back to our old friend Richard Dawkins and a quote from Dawkins from the God Delusion to kind of drive home that point for us. Dawkins here says, nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck. His words, not mine. Anthropically justified. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley in his book Mendel's Demon has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, our kind of cell with a nucleus and various other complicated features, such as mitochondria, which are not present in bacteria, was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. That is remarkable. And what Dawkins is starting to wrap his arms around here is a topic we're going to talk about a little bit later down the road, of irreducible complexity. And we're going to talk about that in the weeks to come and just how impossible this is. But what he's getting at here is the cell inside of us is this enormously complex machine, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. The origin of consciousness might also be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. One-off events like this might be explained by the anthropic principle along the following lines. There are billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria and so on and so forth. I'm going to come back to this here in a minute. Now, what he's talking about here, and I want to use a quote from Drs. Lewis and Barnes from their book, A Fortunate Universe, is how incredibly complex the cells are that make up us. And I used this quote, I know, a few weeks ago in our study on the cell, on the cells that make up us. Firstly, life, even a single simple cell, is a miracle of complexity. Every cell in your body, for example, has molecular machines for moving itself, tagging and transporting molecules, processing food, defending against invaders, DNA duplication and repair, producing proteins, and receiving and processing outside signals. On top of all of that, this entire machine can tear itself in half and produce a complete working copy in about 20 minutes. That is, if you imagined in any other aspect of life, a machine that was built that could do that in any other area. I think a few weeks ago when we talked about machines and their purpose-built functionality, we talked about building potato chips or something incredibly simple. But can you imagine a machine capable of building these things, maintaining itself, reproducing itself as a machine to produce even more of itself? It is a miracle of complexity. And yet we're supposed to believe that that, again, just happened on its own. So we not only grant the miracle of the first life, but even according to Dawkins, of equally, if not more so, improbability, the evolution from a simple cell to a complex cell. And what makes it so incredibly unlikely is this idea that when we really break it down and start getting into it, how do you go from something very simple to very complex? Now, a few weeks ago, we addressed this when we looked at Richard Dawkins' idea of climbing Mount Improbable. I entitled the episode Falling Off Mount Improbable because I think as good of a job as Richard Dawkins does with the topic, I think his parable breaks down on multiple levels. And this is going to be the problem. Darwin's theory, when we really look at it, his theory of evolution breaks down across the board whenever you look at the beginnings of something. I want to go all the way back to Darwin himself. And I want to quote from Darwin's theory to kind of walk through and talk about this, okay? So this is, again, from The Origin of Species. Owing to this struggle, variations, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding, if they be in any degree profitable to the individual of a species, in their infinitely complex reactions to other organic beings and to their physical conditions of life, will tend to the preservation of such individuals and will generally be inherited by the offspring. I have called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection, which we've all heard, in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. All right, so that is the textbook definition of natural selection. And we know Darwin's theory has changed a little bit today to this idea of random mutation working alongside of natural selection. But again, the idea there of being, look, if you had a creature, let's say out on the African savanna, had a slightly longer neck than its neighbors and its peers, and it could reach up and pull leaves off the trees, it might survive better than the other animals around it. And eventually this quality produced giraffes. And so the giraffes were able to survive because their longer necks allowed them to feed off of trees. And this is the picture that was painted for me as a schoolboy a million years ago when I was in grade school. The problem that Darwin's got here, and I want to throw in one more quote to help start illustrating this. Natural selection can explain how existing species change. That's microevolution, and we all agree. You understand how we could breed one breed of dog from another breed of dog. But macroevolution, this idea that we all came from a common ancestor. And from this first cell, you got trees and fish and birds and slugs and everything else, and eventually human beings. That doesn't work so well. And here's going to be one of the other problems that Darwin throws in. On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable individual differences and variations and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection or the survival of the fittest. Okay, makes sense? Understand everything that he's saying. But how is that going to work to get us there? And again, I want to go back to Richard Dawkins and this idea of climbing Mount Improbable, because when Richard Dawkins addresses this and he tries to paint the picture, he looks at me and says, you're being overly simplistic, making this impossible. It's very easy to explain. And how Dawkins explains it is this, from his book, Climbing Mount Improbable. He says, in Climbing Mount Improbable, I express the point in a parable. One side of a mountain is a sheer cliff, impossible to climb. But on the other side is a gentle slope to the summit. On the summit sits a complex device such as an eye or bacterial flagellar motor. The absurd notion that such complexity could spontaneously self-assemble is symbolized by leaping from the foot of the cliff to the top in one bound. Evolution, by contrast, goes around the back of the mountain and creeps up the gentle slope to the summit. Easy. Okay, Richard Dawkins' words, quoting from the God Delusion, where he's referencing his book, Climbing Mount Improbable. Here's the problem. And here's what we're going to see going forward. If Richard Dawkins is right about Charles Darwin's theory, that doesn't work. And it's never going to work. And Darwin has already laid the groundwork for exactly why it's not going to work. Now, I want to point out 4 problems that come together in all of this, and this is going to drive us in the weeks to come. My contention is that natural selection is incapable of creating new functionality. Generally speaking, obviously, there are ways where natural selection can improve existing, and I understand that. I understand how a creature can evolve a longer neck and eventually go from a horse-like creature to a giraffe. We all understand it. I've heard the stories. I've seen the movie, been there, done that. That's fine. But the problem is, you need to take some steps back. We understand how an eye could improve, but how could an eye begin? How do you go from not seeing to seeing? And this is going to be the problem that I think Charles Darwin originally, and Richard Dawkins now to a similar degree, kind of skips over the beginning part, which is critically important in all of this. So what are the 4 problems with climbing Mount Improbable? Briefly, and again, for the full explanation, go back to my episode from a few weeks ago, falling off Mount Improbable. All right, number 1, and remember, Richard Dawkins was addressing this idea of an eye, like, an eye being at the top of the mountain. Okay, how do we go in this simple, slow process? Well, the interesting thing is, why are we going there at all? Where does the prize on top of the mountain come from? So we're all looking at this saying, okay, an eye, vision, is what really is represented at the top of the mountain. It's not even so much, before the journey begins, it's not a functioning body part, it's an idea. And the idea is the problem. How does evolution know? Unless we grant evolution godlike powers, which again, Darwin, was accused of back in the 1800s. Unless we give natural selection and random mutation godlike powers, how does the idea get to the top of Mount Improbable so that natural selection can begin the journey there? If we're with that first cell, even a very evolved first cell that has all of the functioning body parts, all the functioning parts that make us, how does it know that vision is a good thing? How does it know that breathing is a good thing or walking is a good thing? And 2 legs would be better than 1 leg, and a joint in the middle would be great. Or, an arm. An arm is much better with this elbow joint in it and a really complex shoulder joint up here, and all of these fingers. How does natural selection know that the idea at the top of Mount Improbable is worth pursuing? It can't. So it never starts the journey. Because why would natural selection begin a journey to an idea? Yes, admittedly, it's an improvement. How does it know that? How can it possibly know before the functioning body part exists? That's number 1. Number 2, how does it begin the journey? How does it start? How or why would it begin the journey at all? When I think about climbing a mountain, and I've climbed a mountain in my life, I've tried to climb one and failed, climbed another one successfully. But when I did that, it was based on purposeful choice. It was based on, if you think climbing a mountain is easy, you didn't climb a mountain, you climbed a hill. Climbing a mountain is rarely easy. It usually requires an enormous amount of work. That's why it's a mountain, not a hill. So starting the process, why would natural selection, number 1, grasp the idea that there's something worth doing? And then number 2, how does natural selection know how to begin the process? Before I begin a hike like that where I climb a mountain, I go through a list of things I'm going to need. I'm going to need a poncho. I'm going to need water. I'm going to need snacks and food, some nourishment along the way. I'm going to need a first aid kit. I'm going to need there's a list of things that I'm going to need. Every hiker has their top 10 list of things that they need to go into their pack. I'm going to need all of those things before I put on my hiking boots and I start the journey. How does natural selection know to do that? How does it start that journey to begin building the body parts? You need a plan. Well, where does the plan come from to get you to the idea on top of the hill? Idea on top of the hill is recognition of intelligence. The plan to get there in the beginning of the journey is intelligence once again. So none of this makes a lot of sense that natural selection could just simply begin this journey just because. That doesn't work for anybody when we really think about it. Number 3, why is natural selection suddenly so patient? This is going to be one of the biggest problems in all of this. I want to read 2 quotes, one from Charles Darwin and one from Richard Dawkins. And they illustrate the point better than I ever could. From Richard Dawkins in the God Delusion, religion is so wasteful, so extravagant, and Darwinian selection habitually targets and eliminates waste. Nature is a miserly accountant, grudging the pennies, watching the clock, punishing the smallest extravagance. Okay, I want you to hold on to that for a minute, and here's Charles Darwin making the same point. On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. Thus, the preservation of favorable individual differences and variations and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection or survival of the fittest. You see the problem jumping out? When we begin a journey, we have an idea on top of Mount Improbable. It's vision. We've started the journey building the body parts that will someday create an I. And granted, you've got to start with you got to get there to that first step is going to be a simple I. And then you're going to have a more complex I and so on and so forth. But how do you start assembling all of these body parts if natural selection is, by Richard Dawkins, a miserly accountant grudging the pennies, watching the clock, punishing the smallest extravagance? It would take millions of years to evolve an I. How is it that the body continues growing something that doesn't work? Because it's going to be a very long time from the start of the process to the end of the process. And in between, you don't have functioning vision. Darwin will, try to jump over this by starting the journey partway through with a light-sensitive patch, basically, of nerves. He doesn't get to do that, by the way. But when you look at that, why is it that that natural selection becomes patient and doesn't get rid of this non-functioning body part? By their definition of what natural selection does, natural selection should say, that doesn't work, it's wasting time and precious energy from this body, off, gone. But for some reason, when it's developing important body parts and traits, it's able not to do that. You understand why Charles Darwin was accused of infusing natural selection with godlike powers. Because that's what it's going to take to get there. And finally, the 4th problem, which again I think is also equally big, how is every step unguided? Because any point when you look at the eye, or you look at what makes up my arm from the shoulder to the elbow to the hand, things like that, there's a lot that goes into this. There's a lot that goes into these body parts. How is it that it's an unguided process? Because to produce something like an eye, which is a complex machine, you have to have a plan. And the only thing with a plan is intelligence. And you understand, here's the problem that Richard Dawkins and Charles Darwin are trying to explain, but their explanation falls short in all of this, in my opinion. The only way you get past these 4 problems, the idea at the top of the mountain, starting the journey, patiently moving through the journey and not stopping, and then finding the correct path all the way up, the only way that you do that is intelligence. It's just as easy to get lost on the way up a mountain and never reach the top as it is. It's way easier to do that than actually make it to the top. What happens if it's fogged in? What happens if you didn't load the route into your GPS or into your phone before you go? You may not get there. The only way I can make it to the top of a mountain is time, planning, preparation, and usually a good map is a really important thing. But natural selection has none of that. So this idea that Richard Dawkins paints, climbing Mount Improbable, on the summit sits a complex device, such as an eye or a bacterial flagellar motor. The absurd notion that such complexity could spontaneously self-assemble is symbolized by leaping from the foot of the cliff to the top in one bound. Evolution, by contrast, goes around the back of the mountain and creeps up the gentle slope to the summit. Easy. How? There's none of that. I appreciate his parable. I appreciate what he's trying to put together. And it is the best explanation from a naturalistic perspective to get there. But when you really break it down, it completely falls apart. It doesn't work, and it's not going to work. Purpose and determination are required to climb a mountain. Intelligence, purpose, determination. It's all things that an intelligent creature does that his theory is never going to be able to explain. So this is going to be our problem going forward, and I want you to consider that at each step along the way, natural selection is going to be atrociously bad at explaining how we came up with new body parts, new body functions, these ideas, these concepts that eventually became the complex parts of us. How does natural selection begin the process and ever get there? And that's what we're going to talk about in the weeks to come with some really practical examples. This is something that we can all pretty easily wrap our arms around, and we're really going to sink our teeth into this idea in the weeks to come. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we're stopped there. I've gone on longer than I thought I would tonight. Next time when we get together, we're going to really start jumping into this, and we're going to start talking about some of these complex functions and how they could have come together. But between now and then, if you liked this episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast as a whole. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find us more information on our website at prooftograce.com, and you can reach out to us via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode, and I really hope you'll stick with us on this journey as we reach closer and closer, in my humble opinion, to the intelligent designer who created us and loved us so very much that he gave everything for a relationship with each one of us. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you next time. Bye-bye.